Hi everyone, good evening. We're just gonna give people a couple of minutes to join, to welcome. You are welcome to have your cameras on if you wish, just need you to stay on mute. Welcome to those people who have just joined. Welcome. We'll be starting in just a moment. Can see some familiar names. Nice to see you again. Okay, so good evening and a very warm welcome for the third time, or simply welcome to those who are joining us for the first time today. So this is the third installment of the Pan-African Pantheon lecture series that takes a critical look at some of the main prophets, philosophers and poets involved in Pan-Africanism. If you would just give me one moment, sorry, my screen seems to have frozen. Sorry guys, give me one moment, something's just closed. Typical technology, I'm sorry, just give me a moment. Thank you, Raquel, I appreciate that.
Hey guys, please bear with us. The tech gremlins are at work.
Awful.
Yeah. So while Akaita gets situated, perhaps I can introduce myself. My name is Nigel from Center of Pan-African Thought. I'm the founder and director here. Akaita will be coming back to host and moderate. Don't worry about that. But just before we restart, I just want to know in the chat actually where you're all joining us from. 2 weeks ago, we had people from all over the world, from the UK, from Canada, and of course, many of our comrades and friends from across the continent. So particularly South Africa. So it'd be really, really great to let us know, to just get a sense of which part of the world that you're joining us from, so we know which part of the world the center's reached. Wow, Mexico. Unbelievable. Be great to know how you heard about this lecture. That's fantastic. Pretoria, South Africa in the house, strong. Cape Town, South Africa again. Trinidad, love that. Johannesburg. Wonderful, wonderful. Please keep those coming and let us know. Trinidad and Tobago. Andy, yeah, welcome Andy. Andy was here last week, gave us a fantastic lecture on Dudley Thompson. Welcome to Kwaku, Professor Kwaku, who'll be with us next week. And I'm pleased to say, it looks like we've beaten the tech gremlins and Kaita is back with us. Yes. And I'm gonna hand over to her to continue her introduction.
Thank you, Nigel. Okay, so we'll try that again. My name is Kaita Alfred and I'm your host and moderator for the series, so long as technology will allow me to do this. So for those of you who are here for the first time, the aim is to use these sessions to just reflect on, evaluate and reassert our commitment to Pan-Africanism. A dominant theme of the series has been the need to return to a Pan-Africanism from the ground up and redevelop Pan-Africanism from its civil society foundation, a Pan-Africanism of the people, and a Pan-Africanism with a strong voice and a strong influence on power and the political actors who represent us. We wholeheartedly agree when Professor Ade affirmed the need for a strong civil society, with strong civil engagement being the only way that Pan-Africanism will work for the people. We want a Pan-Africanism that truly liberates Africa and her people once and for all. So now let's focus on tonight's guest and lecture for the evening. We say every week that we are privileged to be in the company of some of the foremost international scholars, and tonight is no different. And judging by the book chapter tonight, I imagine it's going to provoke some somewhat controversial or contentious discussion. We are so pleased that tonight's scholar has agreed to speak, because one thing that we respect is the critical and objective eye on our icons and our heroes. I don't believe that there is a man or woman in history that should be lauded without critical analysis of their contribution to Pan-Africanism. And it's fair to say that our speaker has done just that concerning our next pantheon. Please remember, so that the lecture feels a little less virtual, that you are very welcome to stay on camera so that our speaker can see you, but please just stay on mute until the Q&A. And don't be shy, have as much conversation and dialogue in the chat with your peers on the call as you can. So without further delay, let me introduce you to Lee Daniels. Lee is a journalist who previously worked for the Washington Post and New York Times, amongst other US media organizations. He is the former editor of the National Urban League publication, The State of Black America, and a former director of communications at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Legal Defense and Education Fund. He's also the author of a book called The Last Chance, The Political Threat to Black America. Lee is going to talk to us tonight about the one and only El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, more popularly known as Malcom X. So Lee, on behalf of the Centre and our attendees, please accept our warm welcome to the platform.
Thank you, and it's great to be with you. Please forgive my voice. This is the voice of the summer cold, which I picked up somewhere. So it may creak now and then, but it should last until the end of this. Thank you. I'm very happy to be invited to speak to you about and hopefully contribute to the ongoing consideration of Malcom X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, the man, and even more importantly, the idea and the ideal, particularly against the backdrop of this moment, when it's become so clear how thin is the commitment to democracy across the globe, but especially and shockingly to some, among millions of whites in the United States and in Europe. I must praise Ade for asking me to consider Malcom X, El-Hajj Malik for this seminal book that will always be seen as a critical part of the reconsideration of the construction of the West and of the participation in it and confrontation with it of peoples of African descent. But before I begin, in the interest of full disclosure, a bit of autobiography is in order. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, so I have a bit of Black Chicago culture in me. But I spent my teen years in Boston, Massachusetts. So culturally speaking, I'm primarily a Black Bostonian. And because I grew up in Boston in the 1960s, the national Black freedom struggle and the Boston school desegregation movement of that decade, I have, like many Black Bostonians at that time, a less than 6 degrees of separation relationship to 3 of the most prominent figures of the Black American freedom struggle of the 20th century. Now, beyond the communal foundation that produced this, with me, they all come through one man, the late Reverend Michael E. Haynes. Reverend Haynes, who died at 90 in the fall of 2019, was an extraordinary figure, a credentialed minister who led one of Black Boston's historic churches, 12th Baptist Church, for 4 decades, a trained social worker who mentored 50 years worth of Black teenagers, a Massachusetts state representative for some 20 years, a member of the state parole board for some 30 years, and he also happened to be the brother of the jazz great Roy Haynes. In the early 1950s, Haynes was one of 2 co-junior ministers at 12th Baptist Church. His colleague was a young guy from the South studying at Boston University School of Theology. Of course, that young man was Martin Luther King Jr. Mike Haynes and King and Coretta were close friends all their lives. That relationship led one day in September of 1965 to myself and a clutch of other Haynes proteges standing in the very small pastor's office at 12th Baptist Church for a photo with Martin Luther King Jr. I've always considered that one of those moments of a lifetime. Through my link with Mike Haynes, I'm also more distantly, communally connected to Malcom X, El-Hajj Malik. His aunt, Ella Collins, lived in Boston, and before she became a member of the Nation of Islam, was a member of 12th Baptist Church. Many Black adults that I knew her, and a lesser number knew Malcolm, who lived with her in Boston a relatively short time before he got sent up the river to the state penitentiary for burglary. In prison, he was converted to the Nation of Islam. Finally, as a young minister, social worker in the late 1940s, Haynes mentored a high schooler who was a fine classical violinist. That young man in the early 1950s went off to college in North Carolina, a historically Black college, of course, the legendary Winston-Salem State College. There, even though somewhat sheltered by the college campus environment, he was so immediately and devastatingly traumatized by his first encounter with the Southern racist environment that within 3 weeks, his roommates called Reverend Haynes and pleaded with him to come get him and take him back north. Dutifully, Reverend Haynes drove to North Carolina, collected that young man, and brought him back to Boston. Then Black Boston knew this young man as Lewis Walcott. Today, the world knows him as Louis Farrakhan. So, about Malcom X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. To open my essay, I wrote, "We know who Malcom X was. the young Black American who rose out of a life of poverty and crime to extraordinary international fame in the late 1950s and early 1960s as the fiery, charismatic spokesman of the Black American separatist organization, the Nation of Islam. But who was El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, the man who had been Malcolm X, but who discarded that name and left the Nation of Islam after journeying to Mecca and seeing the true face of Islam and the true faces of the world's Muslims? And why is it that the world almost universally still speaks the name Malcolm X and almost never speaks the name that man who was so concerned with identity, with getting the names right? That man called himself in the last year of his life, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. In one sense, it is astonishing that Malcolm X continues to so fascinate the world. For example, his autobiography, As Told to Alex Haley, continues to be widely considered one of the most important books of the whole 20th century. The 1992 Spike Lee biopic of him, Malcolm X, continues to have iconic status in the film community. And the late Black American scholar Manning Marable's 2011 biography, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, continues to provoke a number of controversies, furious controversies. And now this year we have the long-awaited Less Pain, Tamara Payne biography, The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. After all, Malcolm X led no true organized national or local community movements. He was responsible for nothing that tangibly improved the situation of Black Americans in the 1950s and 1960s. No broad national legislation advancing their interest, no aiding of Blacks in a small Southern city or town in their quest for basic human rights, no broad or small scale economic development program, not even the building of one housing project for poor people, nor a single free breakfast program of the type that the Black Panthers operated in several American cities from the late 1960s to the early 1970s. The man who took the name Malcolm X and then El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz flashed across the political landscape spectacularly, but briefly, and then was gone, assassinated not by the white devils he had so often railed against, at least not directly, but by adherents, Black men of the Nation of Islam itself. But for many, the man who called himself Malcolm X was then and remains today the counterpoint to, and even still the skeptic of, the nonviolent integrationist ethos of the civil rights movement of those decades. As the Nation of Islam's chief spokesman, Malcolm X scathingly denounced the civil rights movement's Christian and Gandhian stance of Black Americans turning the other cheek to white racist violence and pleading, so he charged, with white Americans to let Blacks integrate into a society which throughout the 3.5 centuries of the Black presence on American soil had made it clear they were there only to be unfairly used and degraded. Tall, handsome, his ramrod straight posture, seemingly the physical manifestation of a profound personal asceticism and an unbending, energetic defiance of white racists, Malcolm X was the very epitome of a fierce, unyielding Black American race warrior. An integral part of that allure was his aggressive promotion of a militant Black pride through praising Black Americans' rootedness in and contemporary connection to Africa and to people of African descent across the globe, wherever they lived. Malcolm's promotion of Pan-Africanism struck a resonant chord among many Black Americans at that historic moment, when the nonviolent mass action phase of the US civil rights movement was sweeping across the American landscape, and Black peoples in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean and other people of color in Asia and Latin America were breaking the chains of European colonialism. Until the early 1960s, discussions in the United States about Africa and Pan-Africanism had overwhelmingly been the province of a small number of Black and some white leftists and intellectuals and veterans of the Garvey movement. The mainstream civil rights organizations had largely kept an arm's length silence about the African and Caribbean anti-colonial movements and publicly avoided any sustained discussion of Pan-Africanism. Their reticence was pragmatic and understandable, given that America's white racists had, since the Russian Revolution of 1917, denigrated the Black freedom struggle as un-American, a communist, socialist, or some other foreign plot. That American society in the late 1950s was just recovering from its vicious bout of leftist witch hunting for communists and other radicals, McCarthyism, made the mainstream civil rights movement's posture the right one for the moment. But by the early 1960s in the US, one did not need to be a committed activist or possess a college degree to understand that across the globe, people of color were challenging white supremacy. The news headlines alone made that clear. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960 and the African National Congress's movement of liberation in South Africa, even the faint sounds of war coming from a faraway place called Vietnam. For growing numbers of African Americans who, as late as the early 1960s, were still being bombarded with Tarzan, King of the Jungle type depictions of Black Africa in Hollywood and European films and the news media, Malcolm's repeated enthusiastic embrace of the African diaspora, along with civil rights demonstrations in the American South, helped jumpstart the Black is Beautiful cultural and political movement that would sweep Black America later in the decade. As for the Nation of Islam, from its shadowy founding in the 1930s by Elijah Muhammad, it had seemingly taken up the mantle of Pan-Africanism and the stance of antagonism towards whites, which had been the foundation of Garvey's Back to Africa movement. Both Garvey and Elijah Muhammad had built their organizations on two of the fundamental responses of Black Americans to their oppression in American society: race pride on the one hand, and on the other, anger toward whites. The stark symbol of the Nation of Islam, the X designation, symbolizing that Black Americans were a people who had been robbed of their true African names and thus their true heritage, was Elijah Muhammad's brilliant idea. But it was the charismatic Malcolm himself who made the Black Muslims' fierce indictment of America's flawed democracy enormously appealing. That appeal swayed even many Black Americans who otherwise wanted nothing to do with, in the words of Les and Tamara Payne, the Nation of Islam's hocus pocus religiosity. No figure in Black American history so effectively embodied and so fiercely and openly articulated the qualities of a militant race pride and anger. In other words, Malcolm X's forging a place for Pan-Africanism on the roster of public discourse among Black Americans during these years, while expanding his indictment of America's white power structure to include its policies and actions abroad, and denouncing the pernicious impact of European colonialism, led the way in helping all sorts of Black Americans to intensify their pride in being Black and to consider their predicament within a global context. Further, the attention that Malcolm's fierce criticism of the American government and fervent embrace of the Pan-Africanist cause brought him in Black Africa, the Middle East, and even China, undoubtedly led some abroad, to jettison or at least modify the stereotypes that they had about Black Americans too. These developments are likely among Malcolm's greatest contribution to the Black American liberation struggle. Nonetheless, the Black nationalist stance of the Nation of Islam and the engagement of the post-Nation of Islam, Malcom X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz with Pan-Africanism is a far more complex matter than is often acknowledged. Both postures represented the 20th century culmination of one side of the long-standing intra-group debate among Black Americans about the two major responses to their struggle in the United States. The other side of that debate, whose chief spokesman was Martin Luther King Jr., declared an unabashed allegiance to the nonviolent pursuit of democratic political reform. The outcome of this contest had and has enormous consequences and implications. On the one hand, the ultimate victory of King's viewpoint over that of the Malcom X of the Nation of Islam was not only underscored by Black America's reaffirmation of regarding itself as an American as well as an African people, it was most strikingly reflected by the transformation of Malcolm X himself, a change only partially completed at the time of his murder that resulted from his discovering through his pilgrimage to Mecca the simultaneously simple and complex qualities of two other elements of Black Americans' fundamental group makeup: faith and its offspring, hope. That discovery is part of the reason why the man who had become globally famous as Malcolm X would leave the Nation of Islam, begin to rearrange his views of white people as individuals and of white people as part of the American and European political systems, and change his name to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. But the complexity does not end there. The efforts of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz to connect the American Black freedom struggle to the Pan-Africanist idea not only illuminated Pan-Africanism's positive impact among African descended peoples, they also illuminated its limitations. I'll come back to this in a moment. What Malcolm X represented to Black Americans cannot be understood without considering the specific Black environment into which he was born and the specific cohort of Black Americans he most directly spoke to and for. Particularly in the in those latter years when he reached the height of his fame, meaning the early 1960s, the bite of his rhetoric was all the sharper because he was speaking not just about the slave era or the apartheid of America's Jim Crow South. Rather, Malcolm's appeal was most directly rooted in the 20th century experience of Black Americans outside the South, those who lived in the urban centers of the North and West, where he himself was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925, and where he lived at various times in Detroit, Michigan, in Harlem, in Boston, Massachusetts. These were communities whose explosive growth in the preceding decades was a product of Blacks' great migration out of the South, ultimately reaching nearly 6 million Black Americans during the first 6 decades of the 20th century. Those migrants were both fleeing the region's increasingly rigid, violence-filled racial apartheid and pursuing jobs and a greater sense of freedom that the country's industrializing regions offered. True, their critical massing outside the South, and especially the suffocating isolation of the rural South, gave Black Americans access to an entire range of things they needed for the modern world, to the incomes that a far more variegated job structure provided, to elementary, secondary, and college and university level education and vocational training and credentials, to participation in politics, albeit largely minimal, and thus to developing a certain level of political sophistication and influence, to stimulating news and information about the larger American society and the world, and in individual and mass terms, to acquiring a level of cultural sophistication that was absolutely crucial to making Black Americans as a whole a modern people. Further, the Great Migrations enabled Black Americans to develop the resources for an all-out assault on America's legal structure of apartheid. Among other things, it made possible the creation of a broadly educated Black middle class and a stable working class, whom Southern races could not reach physically or economically, to intimidate into surrendering their civil rights activism. This development created and then continually nourished family, professional, and institutional links between Northern and Southern Blacks that assured Northern Blacks would remain committed to considering the civil rights struggle in the South the front line of the overall Black freedom struggle, and thus worthy of having first call on their attention, psychic energy, and resources. The critical mass Black population result in city after city produced civil rights and other civic organizations of a strength that would likely have been quickly destroyed by the Southern racist power structure. And the mass movement of Blacks out of the South gave Blacks access to Northern white liberal money and expertise that helped in funding numerous Black civil rights and communal activities locally, as well as in the South. Yet what the Black newcomers to the North also immediately discovered was what the relatively small number of Blacks living outside of the South before the 20th century had always known. The North was no racial promised land. And Black Americans understood who Malcolm X was and who were the specific cohort of Black Americans he most directly spoke to and for. He most directly represented the potential of the most disrespected, the most crisis-ridden of Black Americans, the poor and those ensnared as he himself had been in a debilitating spiral of criminality. There he stood, an ex-convict with little formal education, but who had shown himself to be a brilliant, charismatic orator and debater who could more than hold his own in a university forum or on a street corner soapbox. In that regard, Malcolm X was both the complement and the contrast to the backgrounds and lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and the rest of the civil rights movement leadership, many of whom were highly formally educated, and to many in the ranks of the civil rights movement itself, who, whether formally educated or not, led conventionally respectable lives. The difference between them and Malcolm, however, was not a function of social class, as Malcolm often claimed it was. White America's post-Civil War commitment to white supremacy meant that most Black Americans were born into poor families, and that all Black Americans were born into and lived in an environment of civic danger. Despite that burden, many millions of them, whether born poor or not, had been able to forge lives of relative comfort, stability, and achievement. A significant number of others, however, had not escaped the consequences of the broken family and community environments that America's structure of apartheid still promoted. Some of them, women as well as men, found relief in the Nation of Islam, whose rigid ideological and behavioral framework explained for them their predicament and sheltered them from the dangerous past life they had endured and the pervasive and vicious psychological dynamics of white racism. Indeed, the rules of membership in the Nation of Islam required them to, in most respects, lead clean living, conventionally bourgeois lives that isolated them not only from white American society, but also significantly from the civic life of Black communities. Many Blacks could and did dismiss the more outrageous characteristics of the Black Muslim ideology and still draw spiritual sustenance from Malcolm's elegantly scathing diatribes, because he provided Black Americans with a psychic safety valve for their anger. By the early 1960s, as I mentioned earlier, that well of anger was deep. After all, Black Americans were Americans too. Like their white counterparts, they too had entered the post-1945 era, ready to enjoy the prosperity that America's newfound global dominance promised. Further, bolstered by a keen sense of their own contributions, military and civilian, to the war effort, they were determined to finally secure the inalienable rights that the US Constitution had promised all American citizens. That challenged demeanor, as Harvard scholar, the late Martin Kilson put it, led to the civil rights movement's pitting its commitment to nonviolent democratic reform against the white South's commitment to using physical violence and economic intimidation to stop them. The set pieces of that war would quickly capture the attention and imagination of the world. Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam stood aloof from the battle, or rather it said it did. In fact, led by Malcom X, it constantly sniped at the civil rights movement from the sidelines, declaring through Malcom X's fierce rhetoric and the Nation of Islam's unbending, hypermasculine culture that nonviolence was for cowards and people who had no pride in themselves. Malcolm's rhetoric, by turns satirical, bluntly comedic, or coldly scathing, appealed to many Blacks of all classes because he seemingly held nothing back. He told it like it is, as a popular phrase of that time put it. But even as Malcolm's flash and fervor steadily increased the Nation of Islam's membership from the 1950s into the 1960s, pushing its enrollment to above the 60,000 mark and drawing significant attention from the white media, most Black Americans, even many of the non-Nation of Islam Blacks who cheered his harsh anti-white rhetoric, considered his role as a Black leader in quite limited terms. He was a psychic safety valve, the surrogate who could powerfully express their justifiable anger. Malcolm was a magnificent, magnetic symbol of Black Americans' will to resist, to persevere. But he was not the only such symbol. He was not the only conduit through which Black Americans' anger was being expressed. In fact, the civil rights movement itself was also a psychic safety valve for the release of Black anger about white racism. Try as he might, Malcolm could not obscure the fact that the civil rights movement was a mass movement, dwarfing in numbers and support the Nation of Islam and other militant Black groups. Nor could he deny with any effect that the movement activist adherence to nonviolence in the face of white racist brutality was not cowardice or foolishness. On the contrary, it expressed an extraordinary courage and sense of purpose. The individual and group discipline required was itself a means of channeling individual and group anger to a positive purpose, and in doing so, asserting the true worth of Black Americans. In other words, Malcolm never understood the singular force from within Black America that he was up against. That force was what I call Black American patriotism. Black American patriotism was not like the often superficial flag-waving patriotism of many white Americans, which depended upon obscuring the many wrongs of the American past and present. On the contrary, Black American patriotism pledged, in full awareness of America's flaws, allegiance to America as it could be in the future. It pledged allegiance not to a feckless integration that was merely a cover for white hegemony, but rather to the idea of true equality of opportunity and tolerance among American citizens. Black American patriotism both sprang from and nourished the faith and hope that were the true foundations of the existence of Black Americans. It was those sentiments that the civil rights movement best expressed, and it was Martin Luther King Jr. who best articulated them. Ironically, neither Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik, nor King would live to see Black Americans due to the Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist sentiment that Malcolm X El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz had expressed so powerfully what they had done to Garveyism and to white Christianity, namely incorporate these ideas as a means of spiritual sustenance and cultural expression in their struggle to gain full rights as American citizens. Malcolm, along with other American Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists of the 1960s and early 1970s, loved to declare, "We are an African people." But in fact, the political and cultural actions of the mass of Black Americans then and over the ensuing half century show conclusively that Black Americans themselves modified that statement to declare, "We are an American people of African descent." In conclusion, I'll make two more points. Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik, was destined to break with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, destined to discover the falsehood of the man and his jerry-rigged ideology. Even a cursory reading of the arc of Malcolm's life and thought during his last half decade makes that clear. His restless energy, his restless intellect and curiosity, and the tumult of the movement were driving him to it. And the great result of his pilgrimage to Mecca in March of 1964, his discovery that faith in humanity and hope for humanity were as essential as racial pride and racial anger in the fight for social justice, intensified his determination to aid the Black freedom struggle in the US, as well as the global freedom struggle. But Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik, had too little time left in his life, now largely consumed with dodging the numerous assassination plots that the Nation of Islam had launched against him, and simply trying to earn enough money to provide for his family, to develop a cohesive body of thought or an organizational framework to carry on his work. Moreover, his post-Mecca rejection of the anti-white rhetoric, which frankly had been so integral to his rise to public prominence, his advocacy of Blacks becoming involved in politics, his assertion that Orthodox Islam could become a powerful force in resolving America's racial problems, and his urging that Black Americans, with the help of African and Arab nations, take their case for human rights to the United Nations, were all wildly disorienting to many of his longtime supporters. After his assassination in February 1965, the organizations that Malcolm had established after his break from the Nation of Islam were soon reduced to complete irrelevance. Nonetheless, consider this: Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, was a man in the process of becoming. His twisting and turning this way and that too is part of the tradition of Black America's freedom struggle, Black America's freedom struggle's continual confrontation with the shape-shifting nature of anti-Black racism in America. If his public search for a solution was more dramatic than, say, that of W.E.B. Du Bois, or yes, of Martin Luther King Jr., it is because it was compressed into a tragically short few months. That does not detract from the stature that Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz well deserves as an enduring symbol of the necessity of resistance to injustice. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions.